let's just redesign the building, and let's get ourselves up to 1,600, so 100 below, or 1,650, you know, to be just below the, you know, to pay respect to One World Trade, but to be the tallest building. I made the decision, I said, change the design, come back with a building that's 1,650 feet tall or better. If we're gonna build the first skyscraper, and we've waited this long to get a chance to do it, it needs to make a powerful statement. It needs to be the best.
My graduates from my school being Forbes, bag drop.
Bag drop.
A mic drop, bag drop.
Bag drop.
Make some noise. I hope you guys fully appreciate this opportunity to hear this gentleman speak. It's not every day that you hear somebody of his caliber, you know, communicate. So this is something that's very, 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 very important, and something, like I said, we actually flew back from LA for this because we understood how important this was. So first and foremost, I want to thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. So which one is mine? This one?
Yeah, that's yours.
Cool. Yeah, so I think I'm on, yeah. So, by the way, it was also important for me. So I was in Boston. We've got 2 projects in Boston and, that we're developing right now. And I was in Boston Wednesday through Friday and left my last meeting and then went and flew to the Hamptons to go to a friend of mine's birthday party. And then I drove in here a couple hours ago so I could make sure I'm here as well, because it's very important.
There you have it. So this is going to be a fun conversation, a high-level conversation. But before, I just want to preface it. So it's interesting how life works. So this was years ago, probably when I first graduated from college. My dad, he got me a book. And I really don't even read a lot of books, honestly. I'm more of an audio guy. But I actually took the time to read this book. And it was The Peebles Principles. And I was reading the book, and I learned a lot about you. But after that, it was an event in New York. It was a networking event in New York. And this is when I first started my career as a financial advisor. I used to be a financial advisor before I did this. And I'm like, I gotta go, because I heard he was gonna be there. So I'm like, I gotta go. And I went by myself, and I met him. And I was telling him, like, you know, I'm a big fan. I read your book. I didn't really have anything to offer, but I just wanted to just introduce myself. And he was like, yeah, man, keep working. I'm sure we'll run into each other again. So like 15 years later, we ran into each other again. So
your dad wanted to let you, he told me before we came, make sure Rashad tells the story of me buying him the book. So thank you on his behalf.
For sure, for sure. So Mr. Peebles needs no introduction, but I'll try to give a brief one before we get into this conversation. Real estate entrepreneur, developer, author, political activist, and you know, it always gave me great pride when I went to South Beach, because when we were young, we used to go to South Beach a lot, and the Royal Palms, and that was your hotel. And I believe that was the only black-owned hotel on South Beach, right?
That's right.
Yeah, so we used to stay there. So I stayed there before I even knew it was your hotel.
That's true.
And when I found out that it was your hotel, I'm like, it gave me even more of a pride to actually stay there. So, and I don't know if these numbers, you know, but I guess I did some Googling. They said 700 million net worth.
Yeah, that was in 2007.
Okay.
So I'll let you do the math.
Slight stunt.
Hey, Mike, edit this. This is going to be $1 billion conversation.
Do the math. But I want to jump into this. So how did you get your start in real estate? I believe it started in D.C., right? With the mayor.
I did start in D.C. And by the way, and I think one of the things you mentioned, the Forbes story about the $700 million, I would not cooperate with them anytime after that, mainly because that isn't who I am. And I don't want anybody to know me based on that, whether it's $1 or 700 or billion, whatever it is. I mean, I would like to think that my purpose is deeper than that. And so, and I got into real estate in D.C. Because I was initially going to be a doctor, and then changed my mind and quit school and went back to D.C. But I learned it from my mother, and I mention that because it shaped who I am and what kind of business person I am. So, and I think it's important for everybody to understand a bit about, I think, what drives me as a business person, because I think it drives you all as well. And we all have different experiences. But I was born in 1960. So that was during the peak of the civil rights movement, the 1960s. And so I remember as an 8-year-old when Dr. King was assassinated. I remember my community being in flames and my mother driving me home from school and having me get down on the floor of the car because our city was, on fire. And I remember Robert Kennedy getting assassinated. And so that shaped my life quite a bit. And so my mother, who had me at 19 years old, was a secretary, and then after buying a house in Prince George's County, Maryland, saw in the closing statement how much the broker's commission was and how little time the person spent with her. And so she decided to go to night school and get her license. And then she and I relocated to Detroit, where her sister was living, and with her husband, who was doing his internship and residency. And that was 1968. So they had already experienced the riots, and we had moved there. And my mother got a real estate sales license, and then a couple years later, my uncle was in private practice and invested in her and backed her as a real estate broker. And she had her own real estate business and brokerage business. And then the recession hit in 1973. And my aunt and uncle moved, and she moved. She and I moved back to D.C. And she got a job in D.C., and it was a job being the sales director for a project called Town Center in Southwest Washington, D.C., which was under urban renewal. And there was no internet, there was no faxing, there was no video conferencing, no FaceTime. So she got her job based on a telephone interview and a resume that was mailed. And so when she reported to work in D.C., they didn't know she was a black woman. And they rescinded the offer and said that they didn't think that the white sales team would be comfortable reporting to a black woman, even though they were selling many of those properties to black professionals. So my mother had to go back and being a secretary. And so I was 13 when that happened. And then fortunately, she got one of her temporary jobs was at Fannie Mae, and she came across, a man who, was a senior executive, and she was a secretary. And when he found out what she was doing, he said, "You're way overqualified for this." And then he arranged for her to get a position as a mortgage analyst at Fannie Mae, and then that helped her resume her career. But I watched her throughout my childhood confront obstacles as a black woman. And so being a black American, there's one obstacle we have, and as black men, we confront that. Women confront that, but black women have double headwinds at them. And I saw that. And so it shaped me. And from day one, I wanted to run a different type of business, and one that would be receptive to someone talented like my mother. And that shaped me as a business person. And that is what I try to do each day I'm in business, is to knock down those kinds of barriers. And so that story I just told you is much more relevant about who I am than Forbes or anybody else saying how much money I got or something like that.
Yeah, clap it up for that. So you went to college, but you didn't finish college. A lot of the stuff you learned in real estate, obviously you watched from mom, and it was kind of self-taught. At 23, you start your own business, but at 26, you develop your own first building. Take us through that process, because at 23, like he said, we were at the Royal Palms. At your building, at 23, you're building it. At 26, you're building your first one. Talk us about that process.
Well, I mean, when I moved back to D.C., my mother thought it was important that I be exposed to black men achieving things, and also to understand the power of politics. So she had me volunteer for a DC in 1974, so I was 14. That's when the city got home rule and got a chance to elect its own government. So she had me volunteer she said, you got to pick one of these candidates that's running for the city council and volunteer for them, for 1 month out of the summer. And I'm like, I don't want to work for free. She said, well, you have to do that, and you got to pick somebody. So I picked the most radical person, the most progressive one. And it was a guy named Marion Barry, and he had, he was the co-founder of SNCC with John Lewis, and led the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Council, and was very active in the civil rights movement with Dr. King, and had come to D.C. and was pressing an agenda for economic empowerment for black people. And so I volunteered for him. I was 14, met him a few times. He was a kind of talkative young man, and we were friendly, and I made him laugh a little bit. He won. And then, he was on the city council. I went to the inauguration and all that stuff. And then after that, 2 years later, my mother said, you need to go work on Capitol Hill, learn politics there. She got me a 6 months patronage or a term to be a page on Capitol Hill. And I didn't even know what that was until I went to work there. So they had a school on the top floor of the Library of Congress, and right across from the U.S. Capitol, and you go to school there from 6 in the morning until 10:30, and then 11 o'clock on, you'd be at the U.S. Capitol, and you'd work as like a messenger for the Congress. So I went up there for 6 months. I ended up staying there for 2 years. I became very friendly with Ron Dellums, who was a congressman from California, John Conyers, who had brought me up there from Michigan, and Charlie Rangel, and I worked for all three of them, and got a chance to really get a perspective about what black leadership was about and what a sense of purpose was. And then after that, I graduated high school, and my graduation ceremony was in the Cannon Caucus room where they elect the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And that morning, my mother and I and my grandfather, my aunt and uncle went over to the White House and got a certificate of achievement from President Carter in the Rose Garden. So I had, kind of big expectations. I was going to be a doctor like my uncle. And then after my first year, I quit. And I went back to D.C., and that was 1979. And then 1980, I started working as an appraiser with for my mother. And then Barry ran for re-election in 1982. And I got much more engaged in his campaign. He won a second term. And within a few months, I was appointed to the Property Assessment Appeal Board, which was a board that reviewed all the real estate assessments for the city. And then the following year, he made me chairperson. So at 23, I was on the most powerful board in the city. At 24, I was chairman of it. And so I was a very powerful person in local politics and local government at that point. And then a year or so later, his government and he agreed to pre-lease an office building that I proposed developing in an area called Anacostia that had been destroyed by the riots that I remember in 1968, and then I became a part of helping rebuild it. And that project was a 100,000 square foot building. The goal was to kickstart economic development in a predominantly black community and start redevelopment of a black community, and then to ignite redevelopment. Today, Homeland Security spent over $5 billion. I built that building in 1980. I delivered it in '89. Today, Homeland Security has a $5 billion campus over there. It's one of the hottest neighborhoods in Washington, D.C., a lot of economic development activity. And that project, though, wasn't easy, though, because I ended up on the front page of the Washington Post, and other people didn't like the fact that Barry had supported someone who was inexperienced like me, and I'd never owned a house, yet alone a building. But I built the building about 9 months early, and that was the beginning of my career. And I would never have been here today if it wasn't for him giving me that opportunity. And that's why I say, we cannot look, every black political leader to knock down these barriers was a target. Dr. King was a target of our own government, by the way. The FBI has never been the friend of black economic empowerment. J. Edgar Hoover ran a racist organization, and that was the culture of the FBI, and they investigated Dr. King, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, every civil rights leader, including Barry. And Barry was vulnerable, and they got him and embarrassed him, but he had done some transformative things, and I am an example of that. And so we can't let one mistake when we live in a society where so many people are given second chances, that we can't say that black men only get one chance, one strike and you're out. And so we got to judge people by the entirety of who they are.
Yes. Clap it up for that, and rest in peace, Samir, Marion Barry. So let me ask you this. There's a lot of people here that are looking to get into real estate development. Your start came from working with the government. How important is it to make inroads with local government officials if you want to be in real estate, especially real estate development? And what are some ways that you can make inroads with politicians?
Great, good question. So first of all, I think one of the reasons why I ended up in a deal where the government was involved is because I could not get a fair chance from the private sector. The DC was a majority black city, and there was one black developer in it when I started. And there was a reason for that, because if the floodgates got open, then, and more of us walked through those doors, then there'd be no excuse to say, well, why don't we have more black developers? And so the development community has never been hospitable to change. And we can look here in New York City, and which hopefully we'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about later, but there's not one major building, not one skyscraper in New York City owned or developed by someone black. And as far as I know, the only major building south of 110th Street owned by a black developer is mine at 108 Leonard Street. So that tells you that we have an unfair system. So the idea, though, and also the idea in the private sector, to break down some barriers, you got to have a lot of cash to do it. In government, you can have political power, the right, the opportunity to vote, the opportunity collectively to shape, the outcome. And so let's just think about Joe Biden. Joe Biden would be on the porch of his house in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, looking out at the ocean as a private citizen if it wasn't for black people, especially black women, because black women brought him to the promised land in Georgia. Never would have won Georgia without black women. He didn't win, he won Michigan because of black voters. He won Pennsylvania because of black voters, and that got him presidency. And in the primary, he was dead in the water there, and it was Jim Clyburn in South Carolina that saved him there. So black Americans elected the President of the United States. So he owes us a big debt. And it's time for us to collect it. And Juneteenth, while a nice, important memory, isn't enough to pay the debt. And I think that's part of the mindset that we need to have. So I got into public-private partnerships because I knew I got a fair chance. There was somebody fighting for me. The mayor of Washington, D.C. said, we're doing this. And it doesn't matter that you're complaining about it or you're saying that he's a protege of mine, so what? I'm doing this. And that was a political power, and the voters backed him up and kept reelecting him. And so public-private partnerships are designed for, in theory, fairness. So if we think about where we are in this country today, there's two issues that this country, the two moments in time right now for this country. The first one is a global pandemic. That COVID has decimated our economy and our country, and this is, a once in a century. The last pandemic of this magnitude was the Spanish flu exactly 100 years ago. And the second one is the unprecedented civil protest around the country, fighting and protesting for economic equality and criminal justice fairness for black Americans. So those are the two moments. So right now, those two moments are ripe for us because you have the government spending trillions of dollars to rebuild our economy, and supposedly the private sector has heard the voices of the protesters and all of us about this quest and our quest for fairness. So the private sector doesn't have those burdens of responsibility. I think they're getting closer to that. So the public sector provides economic opportunities. And so the government does affordable housing by and large. And so my view is that shouldn't affordable housing be reflective of the population demographics of the people who occupy them? And shouldn't the economic benefits from them be reflective of the population demographics? Shouldn't development opportunities in New York City that is 69% of people of color and 53% female, shouldn't those opportunities be distributed reflective of the population demographics? They should be, and they can be, and we have the currency to require that. So that's why I like public-private partnerships. And then on the real estate side, the simplicity of it is that we don't, if I want to go and build a tower in Manhattan, and the site's worth $500 million. I got to go pay $500 million, and that's and whoever pays the most money is going to win that, is going to get the right to buy that property from the seller if it's a private seller. The public sector, the government wants other things. They're not land speculators. So normally they want a certain outcome. They want a certain type of building. They want a certain type of use. And in theory, they say now more often they want inclusion and diversity. And so those are other grading criteria that are not as relevant to dollars. So you can not have to pay as much. The other thing is that you don't pay for the land until you're ready to develop the land. So think about that for a second. Let's use an example. There's a project called 11, X1, right on the High Line that went into foreclosure, et cetera, and that was developed by HFZ. They paid $1 billion for that site. Took them 3 years to develop that site, to start construction. So the carrying costs were about 20% a year, property taxes, insurance, debt service on the interest and the equity. So that's $200 million a year. They're carrying that cost, right? So you're starting off with the land actually costing $1.6 billion. Now go up the street to Hudson Yards, and Related has that whole development there. They don't pay until they commence construction on a piece-by-piece basis. They fix their price back when they got the rights to do it in, I think, 2007. And you know how prices have gone up. So they got this big arbitrage. And then the city and the state gave them a subsidy, apparently, of about $2 billion. And they built a subway station to support that. So there, the developer has made billions of dollars just on the land appreciation and the valuation of the subsidies. And so think about Related, and I hate to pick on them because they're a great company, but think about them as the largest private developer in the United States. Their biggest projects have been public-private partnerships. He started off as a affordable housing tax credit lawyer, then got into building affordable housing himself. Then the AOL Time Warner Center, that was on government land. That was an old New York Coliseum site. And then Hudson Yards, which is going to have a dozen or more buildings, and that was government land. So imagine if I told you, I'm going to sell, we're in a hot market, I'm going to sell you a piece of property that's worth $1 billion. I'm going to sell it to you below market for $700 million, and it's going to take you 3 or 4 years to build the first building, and you don't have to pay me any of the money until then. And there's no interest, and you don't have to pay property taxes, and you don't have to pay any insurance. I'm going to pay all that. Be a great deal, right? And you shouldn't, and you'd have to go out of your way not to make money. So that's the public-private process in a snapshot.
So that's incredible. So let's talk about, since we're on the topic of New York development, the Affirmation Tower. Important, and correct me if I'm wrong, the tallest tower that when it's finished in New York City, the first fully black developers that are doing it. What was the process of getting that and the importance of doing it?
Well, I think first of all, look, this came, the state issued an RFP for that site in 2020, I think, late 2020. And so we had a global pandemic. Already people were leaving New York, businesses were leaving New York, office market was soft before the pandemic. So initially when I looked at it and my team looked at it, we all agreed to pass. And then I happened to be reading an article about Hudson Yards. And I'm like, wait a minute, we ought to go, maybe we should go after this site because the chances are we won't be building anything for 3, 4, 5 years. So, and prices are down now, so maybe we take a shot and tie it up. So we kicked it around and we looked at what the use could be. And then I thought about it and I said, if I'm gonna take a risk and do something in New York, because this is probably the last big deal I'm gonna do in New York for a while, how do I wanna do it? I wanna do it differently. And so I started off saying I want it to be all black owned. Or majority black owned. So I called up Cheryl McKizak, who runs the oldest black owned construction company in the country. And I said, look, I want you to, partner up with Suffolk, who is the largest privately owned construction company in the country who we do business with. I want you to partner up with them. We're going to do this on a joint venture basis, and we're going to develop this project, and I want you to also be a owner in the development. So she came in on the development team as well. And then Craig Livingston of Exact Capital brought him in, and then our company. But I recognize, and I think this is always very important, I think the true mark of business intelligence is to recognize our own limitations, right? So I had never built a skyscraper in New York before. So I said, okay, well, let's make it so that's not an excuse not to pick us. So I contacted a friend and business associate, Steve Witkoff, who had just finished a building called 111 Murray, which was a super tall building and geometry-wise similar to what I wanted to build. And brought him in, and he's a 20% partner, and his company and our company are co-developing it. And so once we had the ownership set, and I said, okay, I want to build a transformative building. I want a black architect, but I want to send a message. So I brought in David Adjaye. David Adjaye is he's one of the top architects in the world and the world's most prominent black architect. He did the Museum for African American History and Culture on the Smithsonian Mall. So I brought him in to do the design. And then we brought in, I wanted to give the NAACP of New York their headquarters in our building, brought them in. And then the design, so David designed the building, gave him a sense of what we wanted to do in terms of uses. So it's going to have 2 hotels, sculpture garden, showcasing black New Yorkers who've affected, the lives of, of all of us. And then we do offices, and then observation deck and some other stuff on the roof. So they came back to me with a building that was about 1,250 feet tall and a budget to build it. And super tall buildings are very expensive to build. So 1,250 feet, why 1,250? Well, that's how the layout went on the FAR and so forth. So I said, well, let's look at doing something different. What's the tallest building in New York? And so they said One World Trade. And I looked, we pulled it up on a screen and we're looking at it. And it was really not, so it was 1,700 feet, but it was at the top of a spire, this little antenna almost on the top of it. And so I said, well, why don't let's just redesign the building, and let's get ourselves up to 1,600, so 100 below, or 1,650, to be just below to pay respect to One World Trade, but to be the tallest building. And I also had asked, what's the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere? And it was One World Trade. And I said, to the roof line, what is it? And then there was some other buildings. So we decided to build what would be, I made the decision, I said, change the design, come back with a building that's 1,650 feet tall or better. And that's what we ended up with, and that's how we designed it. Because so my point is that if it's going to be it's the first skyscraper to be built in New York City. If we're going to build the first skyscraper and we've waited this long to get a chance to do it, it needs to make a powerful statement. It needs to be the best.
Go big or go bigger.
So can you walk us through, how does financing for a project like that work?
I think that, the thing about development, and I'd say one of the other elements of why I think I've been successful at this is that I'm a dreamer. I'm a Pisces, and I remember my mother telling me.
That makes sense. When's your birthday?
March 2nd.
March 3rd.
All right.
I'm February 27th, so we're all Pisces.
We got a March thing going, man.
Yeah.
Pisces.
Shout out to the Pisces.
My mother told me that Pisces were dreamers. And so I said, okay, and I took that kind of almost negative. It was like a challenge. I said, well, I'm going to dream big, and I'm going to make them come true. And so I have, again, we talked about this earlier. I worked initially for money because I wanted to be able to eat and have a roof over my head like everybody else, and to live well, and then be able to live as well as anybody else. But it got to a point real fast that, and it was never just that. But I got to a place where I wasn't looking to work for money. I was looking to work for transformation. I wanted to do something very different, and I wanted to make a statement, and I wanted to knock down some barriers so that we could have greater diversity and inclusion, because I just don't think that black Americans we should not be burdened with a disproportionate burden of poverty. And the way that changes isn't by somebody giving it to us, it's that we got to go out and set the course ourselves. So I've always worked to try to do bigger. So I always look at the next bigger deal, the next bigger deal, the next bigger deal. And I always figure, I learned a long time ago, I'll figure it out as I go. And so in this instance, though, I had to prove to the state that we could afford to build it. So the debt, I contacted a fund that we've done a lot of business with, that I know the CEO of the fund, and said, look, we're doing a $3.6 billion development. So good news is you can deploy a whole lot of capital, but I'm going to need you to step up and lend us 60% of that. And then I called one of the largest asset managers in the world who've been touting how they're going to be more inclusive in ESG. And I said, I want you to think beyond affordable housing. I want you to think beyond, helping a few small business people. Let's think bigger. You're going to build the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere, and it's going to be an instant landmark. And you also are going to get to deploy over $1 billion. And so
You're going to get to deploy $1 billion.
Because in the end of the day, they're in the business. You got to think about this. They're in the business to make money. They have to deploy capital to make money. Give you an example. Blackstone just did a fund and raised $25 billion for an equity fund. There's so much capital going on out there that they can't deploy enough. There's more capital than there are opportunities. They just don't look at us as a business opportunity. They look at us philanthropically, as opposed to seeing us as a place to do business and people to do business with. But there's a tremendous amount of capital. So when I was at an event the other day speaking, and I was saying, because I gave a statistic that showed how unfair, white men have this, tremendous advantage. I said, nothing will ever be taken from you guys because they can't deploy all the capital now. So you want to deploy it all, it'll be better. You'll make more money because you'll be able to lend all the money out. So anyway, so the long and short of the story is that we got this firm to step up to over $1 billion of private equity, and then to commit to that and give us a letter. So we went to the state, and when we presented, the one thing that the analyst said is, who was doing the financial analysis, and the consultant said, we have no doubt that you all can finance a building. And I thought that was a pretty powerful statement. A $3.6 billion building, we proposed building a bigger building than anybody else, and we proposed building a taller building than anybody else, and we proposed unprecedented diversity, and also had the money to pay for it. And so I thought that was a winning proposition. And then Andrew Cuomo had to leave office. And then we got a new governor, and she's tiptoeing around, and so they have now canceled the RFP and are going to reissue it. And so that is indicative of what kind of happens is that, in New York more than any place else, is that when we cross the barrier, then the barrier gets moved. But we are close to making an announcement to bring the Civil Rights Museum to Affirmation Tower as well. And we're not giving up, and there's such a great deal of support for what it stands for. And by the way, I am building it for what it stands for. I will be risking almost all of my net worth to build it. But it's something that has to be built. And I want to build something so that when our young people look at the skyline, because that's what New York City is known for, when they look at the skyline, they can see that the tallest building was built by people like them.
Powerful. That's powerful. As you were speaking, I remember this Jay-Z line. He was like, there's more blacks the higher I go. And so you're kicking down doors, you're breaking barriers for all of us. I'm wondering, was there somebody that helped you, like in the mentorship role, as you're climbing this ladder? And on the other end, are you seeing more black African Americans as you're climbing that you're like, you know what, I love what you're doing in this space, let me give you some tutelage as I grow as well?
Yeah, I mean, look, when I started, there were not many black business people in the real estate space, and very few black entrepreneurs. And so my mentorship really came from black politicians. I mean, I cannot underemphasize what I learned from Marion Barry. And I can't underemphasize what I learned from a John Conyers or a Ron Dellums. I mean, they were my role models. And then I'll never forget, and it was Barry who introduced me to other black business leaders in DC. And so when I was doing my first building in Anacostia, the first building I did, so there was another developer who had wanted to develop that, a white developer. And so he leaked out a story to the Washington Post. So one day I came from a meeting outside my office, and my assistant gave me, the messages were on sheets of paper back then. This is 1986. And so it was a call from a reporter at the Washington Post. I said, wow, this is great. They're going to do a nice story about, this nice building that we're doing, built by a Washingtonian, a black developer, redeveloping a major project in a historically black community. We're rebuilding our community. It's all good. It's going to be a great story. So I called the reporter back. Reporter gets on and says, hi, I'm Tom Sherwood. I'm an investigative reporter from the Washington Post. I said, what do you mean investigative reporter? And he said, well, we're looking into your relationship with the mayor and how that resulted in the city paying you more than what the rent's worth for your building. And I'm like, okay, well, let me call you back. So I called the mayor's office and spoke to his press assistant, and the press secretary advised me on how to handle it, and so do a meeting in person, record it, and so forth. So I did this meeting, and I had remembered when I wanted to make it easy for Barry, because I was, I was somewhat politically astute. So when I made my proposal, I had offered to lease the space for less money than what he had signed a letter of intent for with a white developer. So a white developer was going to develop this site, but hadn't had the site under control, and was negotiating with the seller, and went to the seller and gave him this letter from the mayor saying, no one's going to buy your land other than me, and I'm going to pay you $750,000 for it. The broker for that seller happened to be a subtenant of mine and brought the deal to me, and that's how I got it. So we offered, the mayor had signed a letter for $22.50 a square foot. I did a letter for $18.75, so less money. And so it's a better deal for the city. So this guy did this article, and it was on the front page of the Washington Post next to the Iran-Contra articles of Ronald Reagan. There was my little building in Anacostia. I'm like, God, I'm trying to get ahead, and this is what I got to deal with. And I'm 26, so I'm really not, mentally is strong enough to deal with an attack from one of the most powerful media organizations in the country. And I'm like, why are they coming after me? So I went to lunch that day to meet a friend of mine, and I went to this place, it's called Joe and Mo. So it was a power lunch place of DC. A lot of real estate power brokers and political power brokers locally, and some black business people. It was kind of the hangout for the business establishment there in D.C. So I walk in there, and the head of the oldest and largest black bank in the country, Independence Federal Savings Bank, and the guy's name was Billy Fitzgerald. And so I walk down these stairs coming into the restaurant. I'm like holding my head down a little bit. Billy comes over to me, and I was, as I said, 26. He was probably my age now, 62. So he comes over to me and he says, welcome to the club. And then he explained to me that you are not going to have a fan club here. There's not going to be a cheering section for you. There's just going to be landmines and obstacles. And the cheering section is going to be us. We're going to cheer for each other. And you're going to cheer for each other. And I want you to remember this day, that how you're feeling. Well, some of our brothers and sisters are going to feel that same way, and I want you to do what we're going to do today. And so he said, you're taking a day off. I had my lunch. We hung out. We played poker and hung out in the back room and played cards and had a good time, and it cemented a friendship for the rest of my life with him.
Always going to be obstacles in life. Is there a set of real estate commandments that you live by? I know location, innovation is something that I know you were credited for. So can you explain that? And are there real estate commandments that you live by?
Yeah, there are. And the number one is make your money going in. So I gave you a little hint about public-private partnerships. So rumor has it that Hudson Yards, before the pandemic, related was up $3.5 billion on land value alone, and that gave some resources to buy the Dolphins. So that's what rumor has it. But so imagine now, again, if you control the property, you fix the price, and you go 3 years down the line. Remember the billion-dollar asset I told you about, how $200 million a year to carry it. So if the value didn't go up at all, you're up, $600 million if you didn't have to pay that, right? So the public-private deals I like the most because I can control, the price, number one, is not the sole determining factor, and so we have to be smart enough to figure out how to give people something more than price. Two, you pay when you're ready to start putting the land to use and not before. And three, you don't take entitlement risk. So I like to make my money going in. So I take risk, but they're very controlled risk, and I like the public-private space because it allows me to make my money on the land value. So historically, throughout my career, I've always looked to make sure that the day I'm committing to the deal, it's profitable, and that I don't have to ride the market up. I'm insulated, and so make your money going in. Look to get the best value. Anyone, well, not anyone, but most people, I mean, it doesn't take a lot of ingenuity if you have cash or access to capital to go pay more than anybody else. And in a hot market, that's what you have to do in order to control a piece of property in the private sector. So you got to figure out how to do that. And I do it through public-private projects, or I take entitlement risk. I take more complicated deals and then say, give me time to make your deal uncomplicated and I'll pay you more money. And so that's the number one principle is there. And then the second one is to think big. I mean, to be uncomfortable. I mean, you know, I had to stop listening to all my relatives. I had to stop listening to my mother, as well-intended as she was. It's because they're trying to protect me. And I wasn't really interested in being protected. I was interested in excelling, and so I had to get way out of my comfort zone. But I would say that the number one thing, make the money going in.
Okay, valuable lesson. So we obviously talked about the barriers that you face here in New York trying to develop. We know what you've done in DC, but I watched this like 30-minute interview when they were asking about in the next 20 years, where's a place in America that we should be looking at if we're talking about developers? And you said Miami. Obviously, you have some, you know, we talked about our stay there, but what is it that you saw in Miami from the development side that made you make that statement?
Fundamentals. I think you got to look at things. I mean, one of my most favorite quotes that's been inspirational to me for so long, Robert Kennedy used it a lot. It was, some people see things as they are, and they ask why. I dream of things that never were and ask why not. That is how Barack Obama got to be president. Right? That is how all of us have made it, the progress that we've made in our lives is why not? And so I look at Miami, and you have to look at real estate differently. So New York has always been New York, it's New York, New York, New York. Okay, but Miami's growing, and so what would make Miami attractive and why are people beginning to shift down here? Well, they were shifting down to Miami. One reason is nice quality of life, nice weather, no snow, nice quality of life, the beach, the ocean. And then one other thing, and it was the reason I moved there. So I was living there, I got a vacation home there in 1995 and won the rights to the Royal Palm within 6 months. And so I was going back and forth to DC, and my son was 2 years old, and so we had an apartment down there. And I was going back to DC to meet with my office team, my staff on the development side, and then I met with my accountants as well, because it was like in some early April. And it had been hit by this massive snowstorm, and the snow was piled up on both sides of the roads where they plowed it. So I met with my accountants, and they were telling me how much I owed in local taxes. And I'm like, why am I paying that? I mean, I don't, my son doesn't go to public schools, he goes to a private school. I mean, I don't use the infrastructure here. I'm not burdening the infrastructure with that much money. And he said, well, you know, you could save all of this if you just became a Florida resident. So I said, really? All of it? And he said, all of it. So I got a home in Miami, I sold my house in DC, and I moved my company down to Miami. And I did it because of quality of life and economics. So I always felt, okay, if I made that decision, and Washington, DC is my hometown. I mean, if I'm gonna have home field advantage, it was there. It was a predominantly black city. I knew the entire political establishment, and I'd learned to navigate the city, and I picked up and left. So I felt that if I were willing to do that, I mean, couldn't that argument be made by many more people in DC, many people in New York, many people in Chicago, and so forth? And I felt that that would be the case. And also, I found Miami to be more multicultural and more diverse on an everyday experience, as opposed to I saw New York as more segregated. I saw DC as more segregated. And so I thought that that would be the future, of our country, is greater connections amongst people. And so I saw Miami in all those reasons, and it was undervalued. So you could buy an apartment in Miami on the ocean, say back in 2002, you could buy, or right after after 9/11, et cetera, when everything's percolating. Let's go to 2008. You can buy an apartment, a beautiful apartment on the ocean in Miami, the best building for $800 a square foot. Best building in New York was, $8,000 a square foot. So the economics were more compelling. And so I thought for those reasons, Miami had a lot of runway, because it can compete favorably to New York, and it can compete favorably to Chicago and other areas in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic. And that's all true. And then Citadel, Ken Griffin, Illinois' richest citizen, just announced yesterday he's moving his whole company down to Miami. 1,000 people, and taking his money with him. And I think we're going to, and more and more New Yorkers are down there as well. So I think looking at what can be as opposed to what is a great way to invest in real estate.
They're also trying to become the crypto capital of America. They're taking strong steps forward with that. So, yeah, Miami real estate is hot right now. But let me ask you this: as far as the real estate market in general, has not declined. Even when the stock market has declined, crypto has declined. Real estate has continued to go up, and now, interest rates are rising. It's pretty much, I think we're already in a recession, but they haven't announced it yet. They'll probably, after this quarter, we'll probably officially be in a recession. So people are concerned about real estate. What is your overall thoughts about the real estate market, commercial, residential? Are you concerned, or do you have any fear in it?
Well, I mean, I think your assessment is right. I think we are in a recession. We're seeing it, and the statistics will start showing it soon. I think that real estate, if you're in the real estate business, then you can make money in every aspect of it. So I made more money, the most money at the time of our company's history, back in the early 1990s when I started buying. Because we had a banking and financial crisis, and the junk bond crisis and the S&L crisis in the early 90s. I started buying up land in downtown DC, at 20 cents, 10 cents on the dollar. And I was able, I bought one building for $5 million, and then cut a deal with the defaulting tenant to pay off their lease for $1,250,000. So I paid $3,750,000. I ended up holding it for a little while, and then converting it. It was an office building, converting it to a Marriott hotel, which I owned for 20 years. And it was in an enterprise zone in downtown DC, so there was no capital gains tax for the first 20 years. I sold it at the end of the 20th year for $130 million. And I put all in, I think I had $20 million in it. So there's always a way, and we made money all along the way too in cash flow. So if you're in the real estate business, there's going to be great buying opportunities. But I think places like New York, the real estate market's pulled back in New York. And overall in the country, while prices have been holding, volume is down for the 4th straight month. So, but all markets aren't created equally. So New York, there's no reason just fundamentally to think about how New York could continue to hold values, right? Because now it'll hold it at the moderate level and at the what would be entry level for luxury in New York, which is a couple $1 million, because it's supply constrained. But going up beyond that, people are going to be much more interest rate sensitive, because now the cost of a mortgage is double what it was a year ago, and also less people are living here, and people are working remotely. So a place like New York, you'd have to look at certain pockets, but overall, as a market, it's going to pull back. Miami, where they can't build the housing quick enough. They can't build office space. We're doing 2 office buildings in South Beach, because there's not enough office space. And so for King Griffin's going to have to, I don't know where he's going to have his employees. I mean, they have to be in an apartment or something. I mean, they'll work remotely because there's no space for them. So that market is going to continue to attract Nashville, the Sun Belt in general, but the cities with strong fundamentals, lower taxes, business-friendly, and opportunity for growth and quality of life. And so you're going to see some of those markets. Chicago's in big trouble. DC on the office market is in terrible shape, and because people are working remotely. So all markets, it's important that everybody think about this. Yes, there's a recession. So now there will be a time period, and I think what's going to happen, I think we're going to have an experience very similar to 1979, 1980, when OPEC had an oil embargo against us, inflation was running out of control, and the Fed were trying to control inflation by raising interest rates. And it put us into a terrible recession. And then Ronald Reagan came in, and as horrible as he was as a president, he was great for business because what he did is he immediately gave tax cuts and pushing interest rates down. So I think we've got 2 years of very painful experiences to happen in many sectors of our economy, and then it'll roll into, by 2025, you'll start seeing some real runs. So the thing to do on real estate in place is, if you look at real estate as a 12-hour clock, which is how I like to look at real estate, 12 o'clock being the peak, right? Then you want to definitely not be a buyer, you know, at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, right? Because you know you're losing money, right? So you want to start buying, though, about 4 o'clock, 4:30. And you want to buy all the way up until like 7, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, because you're making money. But you buy. So, but from 12 to 4, you're a student of the market. And then from 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, depending on when you bought, you're a seller. And if you play it that way, then you can always perpetually be in real estate. And our company, I focused our company on geographic diversification. That's why we are in multiple markets, because while New York may not be moving, you know, Miami's on fire, so we just do more there, or Charlotte is on fire. So, you know, Boston, life science, office market in Boston's struggling, but life sciences is on fire. Big backlog, so we're doing 2 life science buildings. I mean, so playing geographic product type diversification and being in the real estate business. So make money when other people are losing money. Happens all the time.
Whole lot of game. So can we talk legacy for a sec? Because your company is first generation, right? Obviously your mom introduced you to real estate, but your company, you've started the business yourself. You got 2 children. Obviously your son's in real estate. Your daughter, I'm assuming hopefully, how did you get them involved? Did they just get a natural interest for it because they were watching what you were doing?
Well, it's interesting. My son did not want to work in the company when he was a teenager and so forth. He's more interested in spending some time with me, and so we had this kind of interaction where he'd spend some time with me as I coached him in basketball, but he also spent some time with me working. And so he got exposed to the business a bit, and I gave him little moments. He introduced me at a groundbreaking ceremony for the Bass Club condo, for example, when he was 8 or 9, and I've involved him more in the business. And then let him do his own thing when he went to Columbia, and then after a couple years decided he took an did a summer internship with us, and after working at a couple other places, and then he took to the business. He got a good aptitude for it, and then he and I complement each other. We're similar in some regards, we're different. But I gave him the freedom, to learn. He didn't work for me or report to me. He's reported to 2 different people, one the head of development in New York, and then he went to DC and was on his own while I was here. So more giving him the environment, but also, the rewards. He learned as he matured that he was working for himself. And so, I think that part of that was that, and I think I've instilled, if nothing else, I've instilled in our kids a sense of purpose, and a sense of purpose, not money focused, but a sense of purpose of being a transformer, to observe and see the wrongs in our society, but to not consider themselves spectators, but parts of solutions of how to right these wrongs and how to change the course of things. So. So that's kind of how I got him in. It's interesting, though. My daughter got more like my personality, so she's really stubborn, and so she's told me, I'm never going to work with you. And now she's got a point. She's a rising sophomore at TCU, and she's beginning to say, well, if you're going to if you give me, like some independence, I could maybe work with you. So, right. But I tried to. I called her. I was in L.A. A couple weeks ago. I got COVID, so I was quarantining in L.A. And our company was getting an award for diversity and inclusion here in New York City. And she was in the city. And I said, look, I can't go. I called her the night before, and I said, I can't go. You have time to go and accept the award for me. She said, well, what do you mean? You're not going to be to go? And I said, no. And I said, Donahue's in Charlotte. He can't go. Or he's in Boston, one of the two, and he can't go. So no one from our family's going to be to go, and so, but maybe you go. She said, all right, let me think about it. So next day she calls me up and says, okay, I'll do it. I said, okay, well, I'll have some remarks written for you, and then you can tweak them and so forth. So I had some remarks written for her. And anyway, then she said, okay, I'll do it. And then she said, because somebody has to be there to accept it. And I said, okay. And she said, you should have been here. I said, well, I'm sick. I can't be there. And so anyway, she went and took it and accepted the award and then felt good about it. Felt good about her contributing something and accepting something. And she's, big, proponent and of inclusion for women. And so I think that piqued her interest a little bit. And even today, I said, look, I'm not going to be able to go, hang out with you and watch you horseback ride today. I'm going to be doing this. And she said, well, that's very important. You should go. And she put some water and a soda by the door for me to drink on the ride in. So I think ultimately getting them interested in the greater purpose. I mean, it's hard to motivate someone, especially, someone who's had, never had to worry economically about anything. It's hard to motivate them with money. So it's more about a sense of purpose. And so I think Donahue operates with a sense of purpose. And I think Chloe definitely will, if she goes into the business or does whatever she does, it'll be with a sense of purpose. And again, I think that's the way to be truly successful business people, to be motivated by a sense of purpose. Because at a certain point, you'll get to a place where you say the money isn't worth this. And so you'll need something else to propel you and give you that purpose.
So in 2019, you announced a fund initiated, just a $500 million fund, I believe, for minority and women developers. So how has that gone? What type of projects have been funded with that initiative?
So I've been very frustrated to see the lack of diversity in the development industry and the real estate industry. Very frustrated. And so I've given a lot of thought and research as to why that is the case. And I, came up with, my conclusions were, one, our young people don't get exposed as much to real estate and entrepreneurship as they should. And so I got lucky. I was exposed to it, real estate at 8 years old. But so how do we do that? And so we can do that through exposure early on, through putting it in public school systems. To learn about American history, and the founding fathers is useless to our young people, as opposed to why not teaching them about how to manage money, how to go into business, and so forth. I think so. Exposure to the industry itself and opportunity for adults to get into the industry by having opportunities to work in companies and to learn the business. And then the other one, and the bigger one, was capital. So every black business person I know, and I gotta believe that I'd be interested to see, is there one person in this room or anybody in this room who's in the real estate business or any kind of business doesn't need any money?
Speak now.
No, I'm serious, okay? Raise your hand if you have all the capital you need to start or grow your business. Now think about that. One person in the background, okay. One person, all right. So, all right, now all the room in here, right? So I'm like, everybody I know, so why is that the case? So I did some research. So there is $69 trillion. $69 trillion currently invested in venture capital and private equity. $69 trillion. Now Biden spent less than $2 trillion to try to save the country for COVID and build back from the recession and all that. And $69 trillion in that two sectors. Now, of that $69 trillion, less than 1.3% is invested in firms founded, run, or owned by women and people of color combined. 1.3%. Now, I'll give you a little footnote. Last year, the one group who started the most small businesses of any category were black women. 30% of all small businesses in the United States in 2021 were started by black women. Black women get less than 0.2% of venture capital or private equity. So imagine the unfair advantage. Majority of the country are women, are female. The country is becoming more and more diverse. And so yet we don't have this kind of access to capital. So white men receive 98.7% of all capital. Imagine that. Now imagine how unfair that is. And so when you look at that, I said, okay, well, we got to do something about it. So I can do a private equity fund. I've been doing this for a long time. So I said, I'm going to raise a private equity fund, and I'm going to raise it for, minority developers and women. And so initially I was told, one, you can't do that. I got to say it's for emerging developers, and because I can't do it based on race, and I can't do it based on gender. So I said, okay. So I go to these public employee pension systems, like say New York City, for example. Now, to give you an idea, New York City, 80% of its workforce is people of color, the government, and over 60% of its workforce is female. And yet they have invested less than 3% of their money in firms run or managed by women and people of color combined. And so I went to them, I went to others, and they said, hey, we invest in your company, but we think it's too risky to invest in, minority firms and the small minority firms. And so I have been going around trying to raise this money. I got the state of California teachers gave us a proposal, a term sheet, and we've got some proposals from a couple of different banks. But it's been the hardest exercise to raise. I mean, it took me 35 days or so to get the commitments to finance, our building in Tribeca. It was $540 million. It took less than a month to get commitments of $3.6 billion for Affirmation Tower. And I'm like, wait a minute, this is George Floyd, the protests, all this, everybody's saying they want to do more, and these public employee pension systems would not commit. New York State says they don't do first-time funds. I said, well, we're not a first-time fund. Our company's been in business for almost 40 years. We've been developing for 36 years. Yeah, but you haven't been a fiduciary, so we can't do that. So we have yet to raise a little tiny $500 million fund. And I just told you all, Blackstone raised last month $25 billion for opportunistic. And now the irony is that both the comptroller of the city of New York and the comptroller of the state of New York, Tom DiNapoli, are elected. And no Democrat can win statewide without winning New York City, and no Democrat can win New York City without getting the majority of the black vote. So we need to be more educated about how our capital is deployed. And the irony is, in New York City, again, 80% of the workforce are people of color. And yet we can't get fair access to our own money. So the challenge is access to capital. So if all of you all want to be in a position where one day you can raise your hand like the woman in red, you all need to be engaged in the political process because it's our money. But yet we can't get access to it. Fair access to it. I wouldn't be making this an issue if the 69 trillion was deployed reflective of the population demographics of our country. But it's unfair to have to compete at such an extreme disadvantage. Now, that doesn't mean we give up or have an excuse. I don't look at it as an excuse. I didn't expect it to be harder. My grandparents told me I was going to have to be twice to 3 times as good and never expect it to be easy. I would have hoped by now it would be easier, but it isn't. So my advice is don't expect it to be easy. Keep pushing hard and keep fighting and growing your business and being successful like that 30% of the black women who were starting businesses last year. They didn't give up or quit. They kept going. But at the same hand, we cannot ignore the systemic discrimination when it comes to access to capital. Remember what Dr. King said during the Civil Rights Movement, what good does it do the Negro to desegregate a lunch counter when they can't afford to buy a hamburger, right? So there's a capitalistic democracy, and we need to be active, equal participants in that capitalism. And you all cannot accept this unfairness. And so it's important that you all challenge the system too and demand that these politicians step up. Because think about it, again, this city and this is majority minority. Why is capital not deployed that way? But that's why I'm doing this fund, and I'm keep pushing. And by the way, I committed to putting up 10% of the fund. I'll never forget, I went into one meeting with the owner of a big private equity fund, and we're talking about, I said, I'll put up, we're raising $450 million, and I'm gonna put up personally 10% of it. Now, Blackstone and their $25 billion is putting up like 1 or 2%. And the guy said, you're putting up 10%? And I said, yeah. He said, well, why? I said, you think anybody's going to give me any money if I don't put up 10%? They said, you don't have enough alignment of interest. I said, I want the fund to be raised. So I'm going to keep pushing. And I'm doing it because I know, because of all of you all who didn't raise your hand, I know the challenges that you're having. And that's why I'm going to keep trying to do it. And if I fail, I'm going to keep trying and raising this as an issue. And what I really would like, if I could ask anything from you all, is for you all to start raising this as an issue. It's just not fair, and you shouldn't accept it. And imagine, let's imagine the world in a place where out of that $69 trillion, 13%, which is our population demographic in the United States, went to black businesses. So that would be $8 trillion. We'd all have our hands up, right? So I need you all to realize that this is the frontier that you're going to have to keep confronting, but you're not getting the capital because your ideas aren't as good. You're not getting the capital because you're not capable. You're getting the capital because the way it's deployed is systemically discriminatory, because what these pension funds do is they don't deal directly with us. They deal with Blackstone, BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, and others, and they deploy capital. And capital is deployed by human beings. Companies execute their plans by human beings, and those human beings bring their own perspective. And if they look at you philanthropically, then you're not going to get anything unless they want to give it to you.
So before we wrap, I want to ask a question that I'm sure a lot of people are asking, so I'll ask for you. There's probably a lot of emerging developers here. How can they work with you?
Well, first of all, anyone can reach out to us, and we will try to connect you with some place to have capital. But ultimately, the emerging developers all need to demand to write the comptroller, to write the newspapers, to do op-ed pieces, to write to your politicians, to call them. You want fair access to capital, because that's really what this is all about. And we are never going to make the great progress. There'll be an outlier. There'll be a Robert Smith. There'll be my friend Tracy Maitland or Byron Allen or me or somebody. We'll be outliers, right? But that's because we found that little kind of crack in the wall that no one could see, and we just, by luck, happened to hit it. And so, but in terms of having a meritocracy, that means that we got to open up the doors of capital. And you all have to do it. I cannot do it by myself. I can raise the issues, and I promise you I raise it every time I have a conversation in the media or in environments like this. But you all have to be the change agents. You guys cannot accept this anymore.
Well, we thank you. This has been incredible. I'm impressed by your memory. Like the way you're running these numbers off, I'm trying to do the math in my head. Like, man, this is from 20, 30, 40 years. So thank you for all the knowledge. Thank you for everybody that's been here that got to receive this knowledge. And thank you for all your work that you've done for our community and will continue to do. We appreciate you wholeheartedly.
My pleasure. Appreciate it.
My graduates from my school being Forbes, bag drop.
Bag drop.
A mic drop, bag drop.
Bag drop.